Tale of Sinuhe. Anybody read this before this? Familiar with the story in any way? It's not super popular. It doesn't have the, the broad recognition of some things. But it's a really nice little story, and I think a quite interesting one. But that's me. I like this stuff. Tale of Sinuhe. DJ, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Oh, we don't want to go into that. That'll start a whole new rant that has nothing to do with essay form. Tell me about Sinuhe.
Well, the brief overview of the story, Sinuhe begins with the narrator, Sinuhe speaking, introducing himself as the official worker of the cult who is working for the queen at the time, and then the story transitions into the king's death, which is also known as their god. And then in that fear, after the king's assassination, Sinuhe was scared to go back to Memphis with the upcoming king, which was the son, right, who took place as pharaoh after the king's death. So because he was scared that he didn't want anyone finding out that he was part of the whole assassination, so he fled south, where he was going country to country seeking asylum until he found asylum with a tribe with I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Throughout this class, we will come up against some impossible to pronounce names. I don't care about any of them. You can call them whatever the hell you want.
All right, so he settled down with Eminashi, right, and then he offered him a job because he was bilingual. So he saw that Sinuhe can be of use with his tribe, and then as they progressed, Eminashi started liking him more, and then Sinuhe married his daughter to be part of the tribe as one, and then he was as he was going about his life with he started his own family there, which then he gained the daughter's father's trust, and then he was conquering tribes and became the war commander of that tribe. So, and then moving on from there, the tribe's people didn't like a foreigner to be their leader, so they wanted him out. And then someone challenged him to a fight, which he won. That was the end result of the fight. But then he taught when along with the fight, when it was happening, he received a letter from the pharaoh that took place from his father's death. He wanted Sinuhe to come back because he knew that Sinuhe was a royal chamber member before, so he wanted to come back. So he offered him a luxurious afterlife, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But so Sinuhe thought to himself that all of this is good. I'm the commander-in-chief of this tribe, but as his days go by, there might be a day where he might not win a fight, and it all goes to waste. So being that he was originally from Egypt, afterlife has a huge impact on Egyptians. So they work all their life towards their burial. So they want to achieve a luxurious, happy life after their death amongst the gods. So he basically took that offer that the new king offered him, and he went back to Egypt, which was, I think it was kind of messed up because he had a family already with where he was newly settled. But in sense that he was actually clever too, because he now can go back and all his sins that he was plotting against the king was forgiven, and now he actually can enjoy his life. So my take on this for the first part was Sinuhe was basically like an immigrant, going from country to country, and how he was just seeking asylum, and then he saw an opportunity where he developed on, and then actually started a life. So I can relate to this because my parents came from India, and then my dad started a business here. And then he wanted a better life for me. Same thing, just like Sinuhe, he wanted a better life for his children. So in that sense, I can agree with that. Like he was being an immigrant, but then at the end when he just like changed up everything, where it says I think Sinuhe returned. It's a sentence in the book where it says Sinuhe returned to civilization, right? That is a Egyptians considered this like civilization as a high value because they want to be a part. After that, they want to be part with the gods, and that's mainly what they look up to.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
So basically, he gave up everything just to go back to like enjoying himself as one with the gods. I guess
Okay.
that's my kind of
Okay.
take on this.
Enjoying himself to be one with. Okay. We'll get there. Something I'm not sure. I was following along there. I'm not sure. You said at one point that he was plotting against the king, Sinuhe,
Yeah.
and that's why he ran off.
Yeah, I think because there like that's what I think because he there's no other way there's no other reason he would just run off for no reason. So he has to be like either a spy or like working against the king. But then he didn't know that like the king's son would actually take his place because I think he was young or something.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You turn that off, didn't it blink? What happened? Powering down? Ah, there you go. One of these days I'll get it. There are like 2 buttons to push, and I always push the wrong one. Don't mind me, I'm quoting you here. There was no reason. Proper citation. There was no reason, or I believe you said there was no other reason. He was plotting against the king. Why else would he run off?
Right.
Who was he? What was he doing there? Who was Sinuhe? What was his resume before this story?
He was like a messenger. Or he used, but it says that he worked for the queen.
Yeah, he worked for the royal court. He was, maybe a messenger. I don't know where the hierarchy is in that, but you get a sense that he worked in the royal court. And we learn later that he was fairly well educated. This isn't something where, there's a great public university system in ancient Egypt where anybody can be educated. They educated very few people, and those were the people who worked in the court. Often they had better educations than the kings. Because when you're in charge, you don't need to know how to read and write and do math and stuff. Most still don't. He was a person of some rank in that case. He was of some distinction. He had some, weight in society. Fair to say?
Yes.
And while he was out on a mission, traveling abroad essentially, with the king's son, they get word that back home, king's dead. And he has kind of a bit of a hairy wig out there. Why? Was he plotting against the king?
I mean, he could have let out some secrets that probably led to the king's death because
Okay.
he didn't like.
Is there something in there specifically that says he was plotting against the king? He gives, at certain points, various reasons for why he runs off. When you hear various reasons for anything, how much faith can you put in any of them? Is the first reason somebody gives for doing something the true one? And then they just get panicky and start making up stuff after that? Or do they need to be broken down where the first one is the most untruthful and then they get a little bit closer and then they finally own up to what they did? I don't know. I have a brother-in-law who's a cop. I got to ask him about interrogation strategy. I'm sure there's a science to this. Maybe something, scientific that I can really pin my evidence badge on. But it's unclear. We don't know. He runs off. A moment of panic. Fear.
Like, you would only fear, like, at a moment like this, you would only fear if you've done something wrong where you have a part in it.
Would you?
Yeah, definitely.
It makes sense.
Not really.
Not really?
Because the son maybe not the same as the king. The son has a different opinion.
Yeah, he is traveling with the guy, and I'm going to guess road trips with the royal court, it's not necessarily you're gone for a day and then you're hopping on the red-eye back. He probably, having spent an awful lot of time with the son, he probably knew things about the son that maybe, questionable. Like, the old man's great, the son, let's face it, it's not hard to look around throughout the world and you see, okay, yeah, the big guy, he's great, but Jesus, those kids, what a disaster. You don't know. What's that?
Yeah, so he assumes that
You assume.
something's going to happen.
It's sort of nudging you in that direction because you want it to make sense. You want it to add up. You want to be able to say, that's why he ran off. People do things for reasons, right? There's a logic and an organization in the universe. Question.
No, I just think he could just be generally fearful. Some people just aren't built for war or,
Yeah.
violence, so.
It might be a war situation. Moments of transition are always inherently unstable. Political instability is dangerous, especially in the ancient world. When you have a king, he's not necessarily thinking, well, what happens after I die? They care an awful lot about their funeral services and what happens to them after they die. But, the rest of the world, not so much. They assume, well, okay, we set in place this whole firstborn son thing takes over, so that'll be it. But, sometimes the firstborn son's an idiot. And the secondborn son, not so cool about being second. DJ.
Adding on to that, right, he probably was fearing that, like, the sons might clash together after the king died.
Possibly.
So,
What do you have then?
But there was no clash.
Doesn't mention one. Doesn't mean that it's going to have one. He goes on walkabout over to Syria. You don't know what the hell's going on. He's not getting CNN over there. Anything could be happening. We don't necessarily know. Maybe nothing happens.
Right.
Maybe the son steps into the role and says, okay, yeah, smooth transition. Dad kept me up to speed. I've been getting the briefing books. I know where everything is. No problem. But it's a moment of panic. I think we can all agree. Does it make sense for him to suddenly get up and leave? Not necessarily. Maybe he should have, just hung out for a little bit. Just chill. Let's go back to the Capitol. We'll have the funeral. We'll do all the nice things. We'll sit around and tell stories about him. Oh, what a great guy. What a good king. And then we'll all gather around the conference table and hammer out a plan how we go forward.
I think just humans in general like to put labels on things. So like the thing that he whatever he did, we want to label it as something, but it could just be him doing it
Humans like labels. Humans like to put labels on things. Humans like to put crosstabs on things. Humans like to have orderly filing systems. Humans like reasons. Humans like stability. Humans like logic. But in that, you can see an inherent contradiction. Because sometimes, and Sinuhe provides this example, sometimes we're not all that reasonable. Sometimes we're irrational. Sometimes we do things that we just don't think, especially in moments of fear. You know, I'm not going to go, well, okay, yeah, I'll go. My kids will do things that are irrational sometimes, and they can't explain it afterwards. Why did you glue your pants to the floor? Little things like that. Sometimes we do things that make no sense. Sometimes we do things that have no reasonable basis, no firm logic, that are inherently unstable. Unstable on a personal level, sometimes in reaction to instability on a macro level, like politics. Moments of crisis on a personal and geopolitical scale. Things go sideways, you freak out. Now, so I would argue that, and I can see you're a very rational guy, you're a very logical, in-command guy, and you probably, respond well to orderly, step-by-step instructions, and you can think in an organized fashion. Damn, I want to hire this guy. But at certain points in your life, you're going to do things that freak you out. And you won't even believe how much or how little sense your behavior will make. And it's those moments where we admit that, yeah, reason, logic, not so much. Human beings are more complicated than that. We like to think we're reasonable. We're not. We're caught in a knot. So he flips out and he runs. And he goes off into the wilderness. He is, as TJ points out, very well educated because of his work in the court, very capable guy. He's smart. He stumbles immediately into a, foreign tribe and immediately impresses everybody around him. Not just with the fact that, he beat somebody up, but through his smarts, his ability to organize things, to do things, to structure their rather primitive society, comparatively, along reasonable and logical grounds, like he would have had to do as a court functionary in the big city. So he's very successful. Marries the boss's daughter, starts inheriting some wealth, building his own through prudent, logical, reasonable management. Kind of stuff that, management majors are going to love. Ooh, yes, grow the nut. He does all of this. But then, at a certain time, he hears from the people back home. Not just the people, but who?
That's the new pharaoh.
The new pharaoh. Presumably, I believe, the same guy whom he abandoned on the original trip. And what is it that the new pharaoh, and again, I don't care about names, the new pharaoh says to him?
He said that he sends him a letter coming back, right? And then Sinuhe accepts this, but in that letter he was promised like a proper burial, and like all his sins and everything will be forgiven.
Yeah, that's nice. There's two parts to that. One, yeah, we'll forgive you of everything. We don't yet know that he's done anything wrong, other than the whole, abandoning thing, running off. I don't know, I assume there was some sort of implied punishment for, just ditching the guys you're hanging out with and running off. I mean, no 2 weeks notice even. But the interesting one to me is the first one you mentioned, the funeral.
Yeah.
There's a very big deal placed upon the funeral, which is kind of a weird, think of it in contemporary terms. Come home, we'll give you a good funeral. Is that so much of a pitch? I don't know. DJ.
For Egyptians, it is because like the funeral is what like every Egyptian after they hit a teenage year they work for. So when they have a proper burial with like stories on the walls, that's a way of them being remembered for a longer time.
Absolutely.
And then the more stories that you have and the more songs are sung after your name, like the higher in the noble hierarchy you are.
Mm-hmm. Funeral is a very big deal in this culture at this time, especially. It's sort of the goal to which you're working your entire life. A little macabre, but it's what you got. It is a concern with. I think at one point you used the phrase afterlife. He gives up everything to go back. There are a succession of pitches to him, and it's not automatic, but he does eventually get to where, yeah, I'm going to go back home. And I'm pretty sure they use some variant of the word home in this translation, where he's been living, abroad, shall we say, basically as a semi-nomadic tribal leader. He's been living in this new country, I think it's Syria, for decades. He now has, a lot of wealth built up. He has a wife. He has kids who are now adults, presumably. There are little grandkids scampering around. It's a good life. He worked hard for it. He got there on merit because he was, the smart guy. And he gives it all up just for the funeral.
I mean, it could be like a culture thing, like since or his blueprint. Like at one point in time, he's gonna have to go back.
Otherwise what?
Like he won't feel like he actually succeeded in life.
Hasn't succeeded. I repeat again. Got presumably a nice wife, kids, money, the respect of everyone around him. He is the local leader within the tribe. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me.
Yeah, but like after if he stayed in the tribe after he died, everything that he had would have just been left there. But if he went back to Egypt and got his proper burial. So all his wealth that he would get from the king will be buried with him. So presumably, like, take it with him in the afterlife.
The king makes him a counteroffer. I will pay you a bucket load of money to come home so that you can be buried with it. So essentially, he's not really giving up that much. I mean, he's going home explicitly for the purpose of dying. Presumably, he is of an advanced age. Again, I don't know what the lifespan is we're dealing with, but, he was probably roughly my age. Ugh. He's going to go home to Egypt. That is still home. And throughout this story, it maintains that status of that is home. Home is very much civilization, where he has been living with these nomadic herdsman tribes, is always in some fashion described as a wilderness. And that maintains throughout. Presumably, when he comes and brings all his reasonability, all of his ability to organize, all of his knowledge to these somewhat primitive tribes out in the hinterlands, presumably he civilizes that part of the world a little bit. That's how he rises. That's how he establishes himself, by introducing the knowledge that he has acquired in the court, working for the king. He starts to implement these strategies on a smaller scale, and he becomes a sort of king on his own. But still, it is set up that he is always working in the wilderness. And at the end, he needs to come home. Because no matter what, within the context of this story, civilization is better than wilderness. What is the deal with the funeral? When he comes back, those final paragraphs of him re-entering the city and getting the funeral. What's going on there? There's an awful lot of, shall I say, pomp and circumstance. You could argue that the story itself slows down tremendously right there. Because, there's a lot going on for a while there. He made this big panicky move, and he ran off, and then he got into all these adventures with all these crazy people, and he got into a fight, and that was so cool. I understand fights, and he won, and that's great. We kick ass. But then at the end, it's him coming back into the palace. And he's going through different stages of being like ritually washed. He has dirt that they expressly say needs to get washed off, the dirt of the wilderness that needs to be cleansed from his body. I'm sure his wife loves reading this story because she was back with everybody that he ditched, and she's part of the dirt that he's washing off. I bet he's glad that there was no modern communication to him, and once he left, he was gone. He didn't have to hear from her again. He is washing away the wilderness. He is being led through to the Pharaoh, through enormous rooms, opulent settings, which, you're being led to. Wow, fancy stuff. I'm glad I had all the dirt washed off of me before I came in here. I don't want to walk into a palace all sweaty and gross, I would feel like I was not deserving to be here. It's so impressive. And what is the capstone of this impressive setting? The king, the pharaoh, the head guy, the authority. Who is the one who reaches out to Sinuhe and says, come home. I forgive you your sins. I forgive everything. I will make restitution so that you don't have to give anything up. Just come home. You're one of us, not one of those people.
Well, like, I didn't catch why would he want him back? Like, for what?
Well, here I'm going to say we should step back a little. Sinuhe is a very interesting guy for a lot of reasons. Mainly because I think he's very human. And we don't get a lot of his reasons. Part of humanity is being inscrutable. Nobody goes around and tells you exactly why they do everything. We like our secrets. You know? Nobody wants to know, or nobody wants their browser history found out. He's human. He's identifiable. We're invested in him as a character because, to a certain degree, we can see ourselves in him. We've all had moments of panic. We've all been in situations where we didn't know what was going on and we just want to run. That's universal. So we're locked in with him. But I would argue that at the end of the story, when the story itself starts getting very ceremonial, he's not just taking a shower, he is being cleansed. It's a ritual. Ritual cleansing is a very normal part of the ancient world. Everybody does it. You cannot befoul the presence of divinity by going in dirty. And so there is a cleansing. In the Christian tradition, it's baptism. In order to be in the presence of the divine, you need to be clean. So he is invited into this highly symbolic space, this highly representative space, and I would argue he ceases to be a character at that point. Because, yeah, we can sit there and imagine ourselves, walking through the land of Oz and going, ooh, fancy. But realistically, he's just another figure at that point. He becomes just not an individual, he becomes a representation. Why would this story want the king to welcome him back?
Could it be like, since he was like close with his father, like the new king would want him back so he can actually guide him through how to take the kingdom or something?
Maybe. But there, I think you're bleeding an awful lot on the relationship between these two characters. And I'm saying that I think they're no longer characters at this point. Why would a king want to prove that Sinuhe, or anyone, after decades of running off and doing whatever, anyone can come home?
Forgiveness is key to this.
Forgiveness is key to this. Why?
Because maybe like he wants to set an example that to others that it's okay if you made a mistake, like can be forgiven.
Yeah, an example. Example. You can be forgiven. That's nice. Who's doing the forgiving? king. And the king, since we really don't know anything about him as an individual, is the state. C'est moi. The king is the state. The king is the authority. It's not an individual, it's an institution. And the institution says you can come home. Not only can you come home, and we'll try and make it as inviting as possible, because we don't want you out there with those people. You must come home. It's an imperative. Even if you do something so crazy, even if you go so far off the radar that you're wandering around with those primitives off in the wilderness, even if you go that far afield, your place is still here with us in this kingdom, part of this civilization. Now, on the one hand, that's a beautiful notion. Who doesn't want to know that no matter what they do, and we don't know his motivation, no matter, maybe he was involved in a plot, we don't really know. Maybe it was just panic. One way or the other, it was an example of irrational behavior. But he can be forgiven. And that's a beautiful notion. Not entirely unique for that part of the world. How many religions are built on forgiveness, and the open arms of a deity who will say, no matter what you've done, we can work it out. Come home. But without even getting there just yet, the king, the Pharaoh, wants him to come home. Why? Why would a king be interested in this mid-level, bureaucrat? What does it really matter to the king that, he's off in the hills watching sheep? What does it matter to the king? What's it to him? Why would a king want everybody to feel that they can and should come home? If they wander off, stick with the shepherd thing. If you are a shepherd and your flock gets distracted, says, hey, I'm going to go over there. What are you king of at that point? What are you a shepherd of at that point? Nothing! A shepherd is only as good as the aggregate of sheep over whom he watches. A king is only as good as the totality of the kingdom he commands. So it is in his political interest to impress upon his sheep that no matter what, they come home. Not because it's a good decision, not because it's a rational decision, but because they belong there. He doesn't say, come here, it's a great deal, I'll make it worth your while. He says, come here, it's your home. You belong here. You belong here with us, under me, in our tribe, not with those people. See how the story is doing that? The story is set up, and it proposes this very identifiable, empathetic character, this individual in whom we can see ourselves. We can get involved in that. We can sit there and say, yeah, all right. We make mistakes. We want forgiveness. We want to be welcomed home. And that's why you look at Bible stories and they're just littered with stories of people who go wandering off. The prodigal son and Jonah and Joseph and all of these people go wandering off into the wilderness. Are they welcomed home? Is there a place to come home? And that's inspiring. That's beautiful. That's human. We all want that. No matter what we do, we always have a place called home. But at the same time, the story is working on that other level, that other political, social level that says the king has a vested interest in keeping control of his people. The king has a vested interest in sealing those borders a little bit. Okay, realistically, some people are going to wander off. Let's come up with a tool that can coax them back into the fold, bring them back from the wilderness. Let's make that tool, oh, I don't know, a story. A story that appeals on a very human level. A story that is easy to remember in its broad outlines. You can tell this story in very few points. Guy got scared, wandered off, lived an entire other life in another part of the world, and then in the end felt nostalgic and wanted to come home to lay his bones in his fatherland. And so he did. The basic beats of that story reinforce this notion, and they appeal to us on very human terms because we can identify with the character. We can place ourselves in that position. We've all been in that position in one way or another at some point in our lives, and that's the hook. So the story is playing on that emotional level, and that's where its real power lies on an individualized basis. But you cannot blind yourself to how it's working under the table, how it is shaping your perceptions, how just by reading this story you are imbibing this understanding of, okay, civilization and wilderness. And, well, I belong here. The wilderness is bad. All right, he did okay for himself there, but if he did so well, why wouldn't he stay? Because it was ultimately less desirable than civilization. You can have a good time in the wilderness. You can do very well for yourself out there. But you always have to come home. And there's nothing more important in this part of the world, in this time especially, than your sense of preparing for the afterlife. Because that is more important. Because respecting that and the rituals that go along with that, which are all tied into, again, authority and your position in the community, your position within the hierarchy, your position within the social structure staying exactly how it is, all of that has eternal rewards. And you need to bear that in mind as your priority. Keep society and the rituals and traditions inherent in it whole. And that means you're on the team. Do you like the story? It's a pretty good one. Come on. It's not too long. It's easy to remember. It's easy to tell around a campfire, let's say. When people were wandering around out in the desert, they didn't have, a big shelf of books that they can yank off the trailer, whatever they were traveling around with, cart. You can tell these stories and they make an impression. There aren't too many details in it. We don't know a lot of backstory for Sinuhe. We don't know what he looked like even. All of those details are extraneous. The details we are given tend to be fairly direct and all make a point. They all do what they have to do to drive the story forward. And so the story works very well in an oral tradition. When people tell you stories, Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water. These are stories we all grow up with. We don't have to read. They're just baked into us. And that's where real power lies. because that shapes how you view everything. All right. Any questions? Okay.